Thank you, Professor Sashti. That was a very generous introduction. And so, hello, everyone. Very good morning from Indiana to all of you in Georgia and neighboring states. I'm very pleased to be here this morning to share my passion. As Raj just explained, I'm not only just passionate about teaching that I have been doing for 4 decades, more than 4 decades. I'm very passionate about promoting globalization and global trade. So, what I'm going to be talking to you this morning is I will share my slides, and of course, I'll stay in the background describing it. And as I said, I have also provided my information, which you'll be able to use to be in touch with me anytime for any questions. I'll be very happy to take all your questions towards the end of this session. So I just want to kind of have a more conversation with you on a few technical details about the topic that we've chosen. So let me share my slides and we will go from there. Allow me a moment. Yes, I think we are good for that. And I will just go on a this mode so the slides gets more prominent. Yes, okay, well, we already have been told. And I just want to begin sharing with you how I began my day today, or how many of us begin our day any given morning. And in this age of globalization, and like we all do, what do? We wake up and we pick up our phone. And that's what I did. And of course, this iPhone that you can see is made in more than 40 countries. And as I headed for my coffee, and I looked at my coffee, that of course was made in a machine that was made in China. And the coffee came from the fields of Colombia. Soon after my coffee, it was time for my breakfast. And you can see I also relish tea, which is a Ceylon tea that flown from, and of course, it's called Sri Lanka. And the older name was Ceylon from. So Sri Lanka is an island in Indian Ocean. I'm sure many of you enjoy your tea, which is grown in Sri Lanka and other parts. And by the side, as you can see, very tempting croissant, which of course were flown from French bakery. And of course, before the 2 hours were over in the morning, I had already kind of used the products made in over 50 countries. And that's how all of us are living. This is before I needed to begin my day's activity and get ready, which of course will take me to again clothes made in Vietnam or in Bangladesh and Dominican Republic, or the shoes made somewhere else. So this is not my story, but this is the story of you and me. This is how all of us begin our day. And that's really how globalization has been part of our life now for so many years, that I'll talk later how it's been going on. And of course, this is just a reminder that goods and services that we are using are moving 24/7 around the globe. While we are working daytime, some other people are sleeping, but when it's our night, we see that more than 5 billion people are awake in other parts of the world, and a lot of activities going on. They're traveling, they're producing, and the goods are being transported from one part of the world to the other by air and by sea. And we see our ports are non-stop working as we are unloading on the docks the container ships that are traveling from one part of the world to the other. And as we know, we keep hearing every other day how the LA port is the docks kind of loaded with so many container ships, we don't have enough people to be able to unload them. And so let's just take a moment and understand, reflect on what really is globalization and what is global trade. We know we live in the age of hyperglobalization, But what is globalization? It is really where we have it's a way of life. It's a process where the economic integration of all the economies in the world has happened or is happening with minimal barriers to trade, transportation of goods and services, and communication. Remember, communication is a big piece of it as we are talking to our loved ones, family, and friends across. Similarly, businesses are communicating with businesses in the US, are communicating with their counterparts in the world. So, globalization is really to understand the processes that enable our present lifestyle, where we use goods and services made around the globe, whether it's physical or virtual, right? So, you get up and you use social media, and of course, maybe you use TikTok. So, we are not just using things which are goods and services made here, but goods and services made everywhere else in the world. And of course, if you look at what has happened over the last 80 years since Bretton Woods Conference of the Developed Economies, so as the World War II was ending, our lives got deeply intertwined with economic and political forces around the world. So I'm today trying to kind of explore and explain more of how this process of globalization is impacting our jobs, our economy, and our lives. So the is global trade and international trade are really interchangeable terms. The international trade usually refers to when you talk about trade between two countries or a small group of countries. But global trade really refers to the totality of all that, the entire thing that is happening around the world. So I really will talk about global trade. And of course, we know that it's nothing new. It's been happening for centuries, but we will go into the history a little bit later. We know that today more than 8 billion people across 6 continents, 220 countries and territories are constantly connected through trade and communication. Just to give you a little perspective of how large the volume of this global trade is. So the number that came out at the end of last year in 2024, that the value of the global trade, it's all import and export, $33 trillion. And just to again talk about how large it is, the US GDP in by the second quarter of 2025 that ended in June was about $30 trillion. And what about the US trade? US trade alone is worth $7 trillion, which is, of course, $4 trillion we import and $3 trillion worth we export. Again, explain it a little later more. US alone does 1/4 of the world trade. And we know that when you go to the stores, what do you see? You see the Dollar Tree and the Target and the Walmarts filled with goods that have come from everywhere else in the world. So, what are the highlights of this? That is, China remains the leading exporter of goods and merchandise today, and the United States of America remains world's leading exporter of services. That's very important to know. And while we remain the leading importer of merchandise, but we are also leading exporter of services. And that's what you see through, the product of Microsoft Windows and Mac that world is using, and our several financial services and the other software that is developed, the Hollywood movies and our music that is produced here and related. So US, while remains a leading importer, also is leading exporter of services. And we will also talk about what role Georgia plays and the neighboring states play in terms of that import and export. Just again to kind of introduce the new terms, the developed economies, the concept refers to the economies of US, UK, Canada, EU, a lot of the EU countries, really, Japan and Australia, and the developing economies as we relate it with India, China, Russia, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and others. And here I want to point out China is still a developing economy. And of course, that's a different conversation. Although China is the world's powerhouse, economic powerhouse, but it's still a developing economy. So that's an important point to know. And here I'm sharing a chart with you, which of course has been created by the UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Trade and Development Organization. Uh, well, I know the charts, of course, tell a very nice story, and I would want you to really focus on mainly two colors here. That is the purple color, which is above the zero line. So you can see there are numbers 200, 400, and 600 on the vertical side. You see that's all the positive. And I want you to look at the color that is dominating above that zero line is the purple color, and that refers to the balance of this trade that we have for China. And this is a very limited data from 2022 to 2024, but you can see that how China is consistently has a positive surplus, implying they remain the leading um, trade, leading exporters. That's no reason that they have the largest surplus. And the if you look at the lines which are below that, the inverted one looks like an image, mirror image. You can see there are negative numbers to the side on the left hand side, and the negative numbers implying look at the color which is blue, and the blue color legend, if you read above, is refers to United States. That's us. And we remain to be persistently, consistently in a negative trade balance. I also want to say, as an economist, it's not a bad thing. Well, we consume a lot of things because we are also producing a lot of the things. So that's not a bad thing, but these two things stand out, that we tend to be, the United States, in spite of being a leading exporter of services, is the largest importer of goods. And of course, we seem to be consistently have a negative trade balance. And again, as I said, this is only a part of the story because we also remain leading exporter, and a lot of the capital, the money from rest of the world flows into the United States and into our businesses, which of course keeps US as the richest country in the world. Here is just a little chart, technical one, trying to introduce you the concept of what is called the openness. How open is a country? So, there are countries could be closed or open. Open economies are those which engage in trade with other countries. And of course, today, truly, there is no country in the world which is not, which is closed. All economies are open economies, and US trade openness. This chart is only trying to tell us. So what is openness? We look at it, what is our total volume of trade, which is export plus imports. That's what it says, X plus M. We take it as a share of our GDP and find out the percentages. And we find that, well, this is a chart only showing you since 2008, the year of financial crisis, till now, till about, this is only covering only about 2021, we see that we have been consistently very open, even though there are slight variations, but we consistently, because US has been promoting trade throughout the world, and we are the most open economy. What is trade balance? I have used the term, but here is a technical definition that look at the value of total exports, look at the value of all imports. So what's export is what US sends out to other countries, and imports, M, is the value of goods and services that we buy from other countries. So X minus M is the trade balance. We consistently in the US have negative because we import more than we export. We have some numbers even for our most recent time period. And of course, here is the definition of what's a GDP, the value of all goods and services produced in the country. And we do see that net exports plays a big part in that. Again, some of these concepts require a different conversation completely, but this is just so you can have the information here. Okay, so now let's come back and ask this basic question. Why do countries trade, right? We know that trade was exciting. That's why Columbus discovered America. He was wanting to go to India, which was a big trading country. And of course, we know you've heard the stories of Marco Polo trading all the time, traveling around the world, the Silk Route, and we've heard about the several stories about trade. But the fundamental question we can ask is, why do countries trade? I will explain to you. We produce almost everything in the US, right? Almost everything. Not everything, but we produce almost everything. We make automobiles, but we still import automobiles from other countries. So the question is, why do we import goods and services from other country? Of course, it's because we as consumers like better choices. You want to have a better wine. You want to have better beer coming from Mexico. Or you want to have faster automobiles. You want your Ferrari and Porsche. Or you want to see different movies made in different countries, other music. I like Adele. I'm sure you want to hear that too. Or you have your favorite singers from Colombia or some other countries. And you want the choice of your shoes and handbags, as all of us do. So that's one reason. But there is a more important and a fundamental economic reason, and that is that trade is a win-win situation for all. We trade because this enables us to consume more of everything, more than what we can actually produce. And so, just again, other economic concepts which play an important role is that the basis of trade is what is known as comparative advantage. So what is comparative advantage? We'll take a simple example. Just consider US and Japan, because we have been great trading partners for a long time. So I just want to give you a little sense of it, not get into the too much technicalities. We will just take a simple example, consider two goods, computers and TVs, and just trying to tell you, we got this hypothetical example which says, if you use all the resources that you have, what are the resources? Your labor, technology, land. Given all that, and given what is the state of technology, we want to see how many computers in millions, of course, the numbers is how many millions you could produce either computers or television. So we have the same data for Japan, but of course, Japan's level of set of resources, they may have lesser labor and lesser capital to work with, whereas the US has more labor and capital to work with. So we find that if the US produces only computers, TVs, we have the number could produce 1,000 computers, 1,000 million, right? So instead of going into billions, I just wrote in millions, or 5,000 million TVs. And we find that Japan, if it uses all its resources, can produce 600 million computers or 4,800 million TVs. Our US and Japan both could produce a combination of these two goods, right? So what is the one thing that stands out here? The one thing that stands out here is the following, that US can produce more of computers as well as TVs. We know that, right? We could do both. Then why are we still getting our computers made in Japan, our TVs made in Japan? Of course, now China has outseated everyone. But when we did that, we're still looking at it. Why are we getting this from Japan? So note number one, because given the resources US can produce, more of everything, we say that US has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. So this really was the guiding force in international business. Economists believe that absolute advantage was important right from the time of Adam Smith. He said, okay, what matters is you can produce more and you can sell your things to others. You export, export, and export. But then, in much later, much after Adam Smith, who said this in 18th century, in the 19th century, we had a British economist, David Ricardo. He came out and he said, hey, wait a minute. It's not the absolute advantage that matters. What matters is comparative advantage. Which country has comparative advantage in the production of any good or service? So, what is comparative advantage? It takes me back to the really fundamental concept of economics, and that is opportunity cost. What is opportunity cost? What is it to give up to get something else? For example, you are attending this talk today, you are giving up something for the time that you are. You want to have professional development, you want to learn more about international business and trade and globalization, but you're giving up your valuable time that you could have done something else. You could have relaxed, you could have taken care of the family member, or you could have read something, you could have taught a class, or you could have earned some more money by doing something else. So, in order to, what is the cost of attending this? Is all that you give up. And that's a fundamental economic principle that helps you make a decision. You compare what is your benefit for attending this talk and what is it you're giving up? What is the cost to you? That is the opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is the fundamental principle that will help you make a decision as to what you should do. Similarly, this is what works in trade. Why do countries buy goods from other countries? Or why do two parties trade? Is because the benefit of getting that is more than the cost you have. You know, again, as an economist, I'll tell you, there's nothing called a free lunch. When you want to get something, there is a cost. And of course, you're comparing. If the benefit is greater than the cost, then you go ahead for that. So comparative advantage is really having a lower opportunity cost. And so that's why we were trying to dig deeper. That is why country trade. And of course, we can ignore the technical numbers if you don't want to. But basically, what we are trying to show you is that all the US can do, produce more of both goods, but then it's much better at producing computers because it has to only give up 5 TVs, whereas Japan has to give up 8 TVs to produce one computer. So what does it really mean? US has a lower opportunity cost or a competitive advantage. So it can specialize in the production of computers, whereas when we come to the TVs, how many computers Japan and US have to give up to make one TV? We find that Japan has 1/8 of a computer it has to give up. US has to give up 1/5. So Japan has a lower opportunity cost or a competitive advantage. And of course, so having said that, really the final point is how does it help us? How does it help US and Japan to trade? And of course, what we find without going into the details, we can show you, we can establish that if US specializes in what is good at and Japan specializes in what they are good at, or they have comparative advantage, and the two countries trade, then it's a win-win situation for all, implying that both of us can actually, the two countries are the citizens of the two countries, consumers in two countries can consume more of that. And of course, it brings in the concept of terms of trade, that is at what price to buy these goods from one country to the other. But that, of course, again is another a topic for another day. But the terms of trade, of course, that is, we can benefit by buying it from Japan than producing it, then it's been a win-win for us. And similarly, if Japan can get more computers from us at a more better price, then it's a win-win situation for them. So we trade because it's beneficial for the two parties. It's like any other trade. When you buy things, not only it's out of necessity, but of course it has to benefit both parties. And talking about trade, and I thought it's important that I actually show you a little bit about, oh, what happened? Why did the screen go away? Why is my sharing paused? I
We
did not.
we still see it.
Oh, you still see it?
Yes.
Oh, well, I don't see it. So pardon me and let me see what's happening here. Your screen sharing is paused and I want to resume sharing. Yes, I can see it on my screen. Okay, what happened? Let me try one more time.
Okay.
Uh, why does it say? I'm sure I did something. It says it's paused. Recording is on the cloud. You're using enhance. Oh, pardon me. Why did it pause?
And like I said,
Uh,
we still
you see
see
it? Okay,
we still
okay.
see
So
it.
would you be able to move, Teresa, my slides? Because
Um,
let me see. Enter, share. Yes. Uh, this now it's better?
yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. I
Good.
survived. Today has been a little experiment for me.
Yeah.
All right. So if you can see it on the screen with a little bit of a hiding of it, I don't know what to do with it, but I have prepared based on the data for the last 9 years for Georgia and Indiana, the volume of imports and exports. And it's very interesting if you look at it. So I'll explain to you what is happening. The bottom part, you see the red color of the chart is showing us the legend is the imports, the volume of imports that Indiana does, and the sand color next to it is showing us the volume of export that Indiana does. And now the blue color is representing the imports of Georgia. We need to go back. Imports of Georgia, and the pale yellow color is the exports from Georgia. And of course, as you can see, it's the same pattern in Indiana as in Georgia, as the country as a whole, that we import a lot more than we export. And I'm going to now next show you. Uh, oh, and here are some statistics. Here is some information that's really mind blowing because it really tells us that trade plays such an important role in the economy of Georgia. And here is telling us that 10,778 Georgia companies exported goods in 2022, and 86% of them were all small and medium sized enterprises which have employ less than 500 employees. It's basically trying to tell us is that small businesses play a very important role. You know it, you know of your friends or family who are working with companies like this, who are making things that we're sending it abroad. And so let's see. Here's a map that I'm trying to show you. It tells you not only from Georgia, but this map is showing us, you can identify that we also have the neighboring states from Tennessee, Alabama, and South Carolina, which are so close to Georgia borders that they, in fact, are also engaged in trade. And here is just showing you the trade clusters, mainly because these are the places where you have the goods which are really being used for purpose of exporting. These are all the clusters. These are called metropolitan statistical areas. This map is showing us that. Um, Here you will be again not a surprise. So, what are the countries with whom Georgia has top exports and imports. The top export partners for Georgia, the goods go from Georgia to where? Canada, Mexico, China, Netherlands, and Germany. These are top five countries. Of course, you export to many other countries as well, but these are the top five exporters. And what are the top five importers? The top five importers are Mexico, China, Korea, Germany, and I think it is, again, I can't see it. But that's fine. You have the number. Germany, and this is what? Vietnam, is it? I think Vietnam. Yes, it's Vietnam. So you're not importing anything from Canada, but you're exporting a lot to Canada. And so Canada is an important country for the economy of Georgia. Okay, now what happened? All right, yes. And here are the goods that you are importing and exporting. What are the top goods you are exporting? Is the transportation equipment. But if you look on the other side, the other column, you're also importing transportation equipment. Computer and electronic products, machinery, except electrical, chemicals, and paper is being exported from Georgia to several countries. And what you are importing, transportation equipment, as I just said, because as you know, that of course we have a lot of trade, the agreements with Canada and Mexico, where the transport, the final car product that's finally gets ready in either in Detroit or in Alabama, the goods, it kind of goes through these countries several times. The goods go through transport through these three countries, and we get a final product here. Computers and machinery, chemicals. Again, these are things, even though we produce, but we also import, as we explained to you why, because it benefits us. It's better for us to import than to actually make that. So let's just go through how come we arrived at this stage where we are deeply intertwined with the rest of the world and we live globalization every day. As already said it before, um, globalization, the global trade has been happening for centuries, but globalization is more recent. Why? Because globalization is a way of life, how we are so closely intertwined with all the other countries. And I just want to kind of give a little historical perspective. So, the globalization, we can trace it back to the 19th and the 20th century. Earliest is 19th century. There are first two phases of globalization, which go back to the 19th century, which, of course, as we know, it all could be possible because we had newer means of transport and communication. When the railways were there and we had the large steamships, we were able to transport goods across countries. And of course, by 20th century, we already were having multinational companies that we had, the goods and the trains were moving and the goods were moving across countries. We found that uh, there was one important concept that got developed during this process, and that was the concept of standard time. You know, obviously, unless we were able to standardize the concept of time across countries, it wasn't enough to have around just within the country that we have a central time and eastern time and so on. We needed to standardize around the world. And of course, the world is right now at 24 standardized time zones. And a lot of the time when we do globally, we use the concept of Greenwich Mean Time, the GMT. I think you probably see it on your computer sometimes. When you're setting up time, we find that we are looking at the concept of GMT there. So we know, so that was standardization that needed to be happened. And of course, as we were moving through the pace of globalization, we know the telegrams and the telephones and the telegraphs were introduced. But then, of course, you again need to set up some common tariff rules. In order to do that, there is one of the world's oldest organization that was formed, and that is known as International Telegraph Union. So the point of actually pointing out these little nuggets of information is to understand that when we engage in global trade, we need to set up some rules of the game. We need to negotiate with other countries how are things going to work, right? And so we realize that it was way back in 1865. This still remains to be one of the world's oldest organization, which allowed countries to set up common tariff and the rules of the telegraph, right? The telegrams used to be sent across countries, but then we realized that um, now we no longer use telegrams, right? We don't use telegrams, but then the organization is still very active. This is still based in Paris, and they regulate what? The radio frequencies and spectrum and the satellite orbits. There is also a Berne Copyright Convention that happened in 1886, so that there was an international agreement which governed, which was to kind of look at the copyrights, right, about the books and the writings and the work that was being done. So as we moved, we needed to develop the rules of the game. How do we do the globalization? How do we move forward with increased trade and communication? The third phase of globalization that most of us may be more familiar with, that we saw, is really beginning with the Bretton Woods, 1944, as I talked before. Um, in Bretton Woods, the world's developed economies, the leaders of the world developed economies and famous economists met, and they needed to set up. They saw the end of the World War II happening, and they needed to realize how are we going to move forward in this cooperation and collaborations that were built during the war. And of course, we know the formation of the United Nations, but for the purpose of trade, there were three important things done. They set up two important international organizations called the World Bank, um, and the International Monetary Fund. And these organizations, the main responsibility was that they were supposed to provide funding, right? The many countries were devastated by with war. It was global, and of course we needed funding. We needed to see that we can help cooperate these countries which are war devastated to rebuild their industry, their infrastructure, and so that the world could move on. And the third important piece that was done was to actually have a general agreement on trade and tariff called GATT. It was formalized in 1950, followed by what is known as now today the World Trade Organization, which was founded in 1995. I just want to tell you, when in 1995, the World Trade Organization was set up, China and Russia and many other countries, but of course, China and Russia being two important countries, were not part of the World Trade Organization. Why? Of course, we'll talk about the events, and of course, because China, although it had opened, it opened its economy only in the 1980s. They have a very strong political control in their economy, in their country. There's a political control while the economy is open for export and trade, but politically they continue to maintain a very controlled economy, authoritarian rule. So the world was not really ready to let them join in. But China, by 2001, China had already, many countries had become so dependent on China, and China had loosened some of its trade restrictions and barriers. China was allowed to join World Trade Organization, and in 2012, Russia was inducted in World Trade Organization. So, what does the World Trade Organization really do? It is the basis of the World Trade Organization is the one that really governs the rules of trade between the countries. And of course, if there is a dispute, then you need to resolve, right? So if India and China have a dispute about trade, we're not talking about a war. We're talking about trade, about dispute about a trade. you know, our US has a disagreement with another country, with India, on some item of trade. We will go to World Trade Organization and say, okay, this country is trying to impose unnecessary restriction or barriers, and so World Trade Organization will really intervene there. So as we go into the details, I want to talk about the fourth phase of globalization. Well, again, according to me and some of the other scholars, began really in 1990s. It coincides with the period of IT, information technology revolution, and the internet. Other than that, what happened? There was a new economic and political order. There was the fall of Berlin Wall and disintegration of Soviet Union. So 1989, 1990 were where we saw we that the world order had changed. The communism had ended essentially in large parts of the world. Germany was reunited, and we needed to make sure that we needed to look at what are now going to be the new rules of the trade. There was, of course, European Union, the growth of European Union, and by early 2000, the euro was introduced in part of the Europe, part of the members of the European Union. And in 1994, we had a free trade agreement with a North American free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, which of course was later reformed and called the US Mexico and Canada Act, which is of 2020. The agreement that we have is modified from NAFTA. There were economic reforms in China, India, and other developing countries. They were all embracing free market policies promoted by the World Trade Organization and World Bank and the IMF. There was emergence of new Asian tigers, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, adding to the list of the Asian tigers of Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. There were growing economies of Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. So there was a complete change as we arrive the later half, the last decade of the previous century. More connected world, more instant information flow. As you know, we the first email system was a Hotmail. Um, and when the first time it happened, at that time, I was actually living in India when the Hotmail happened. And because India is 12 hours ahead of time zone, so it would be that when you send an email from the US, when I was in India, I would send a response back, and it would seem like you got a response uh, before time. So it's kind of fascinating what happened. And of course, Yahoo was a big search engine, and then came Google, which really changed the way we started living and thinking and searching. We gave up our encyclopedias, and we were all hooked on to Google. And of course, that brought in new business practices. Outsourcing, I'm sure you have heard about this, that now our businesses in the US and around the world, we were producing our things in other countries. We were doing our software development in India. Our factories were moving to China. We were outsourcing, offshoring our goods and services. And that's how, and in that process, we were getting more and more connected. Globalization was taking deep roots in our lives on everyday basis. And that meant that old treaties, bilateral trades, multilateral trades needed to be refined, because we will lead also heading into increased risk and increased opportunities. The new financial order had to be established, new currency exchange rules had to be set up, and you might have heard there were new international accounting standards that had to be set up. You must have heard in the earlier talk. Obviously, because when there is flow of goods and services, there's flow of money, flow of currency. So you need to, when the businesses have a business spread out as Apple and Microsoft and IBM and Google have their businesses set up everywhere else, then we need to have final accounting rules also have to be more standardized. But then, as we said, more connectedness, like how you live with your neighbors and you're always kind of communicating too much, you're living in each other's lives. it also has its own risks. The same way, when the countries get involved with each other, there is a higher risk. And of course, I'm just listing out a few important financial crises of the last 3 decades. And the crisis of Mexico in 1994, the US had to bail out. 1997 was the Asian currency crisis. Again, the US was bailing out South Korea. They're our friends, and there were crises in East Asia. In 1998, Russia defaulted, Brazil defaulted. And so every time it happened, of course, US was the larger, was one of the countries that really came to the rescue. 1998, another large hedge fund, which was managed also with the advice of two Nobel laureates, suddenly collapsed. And then what happened? President Clinton had to bail out. Reason being because US is really the hub of the financial world. Um, if anything happens to Wall Street, there is a total chaos in the rest of the world, as we noticed what happened later. So these are all the challenges, emerging challenges of globalization. We had terrorist attack on 9/11. Yesterday we all must have seen, it was a reminder 24 years ago. So it was not only disruption to the life in the US, it disrupted life, communication, travel, and transportation around the world. And of course, I'm sure most of you remember that the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, how the big businesses on Wall Street collapsed, and of course, how there was a huge housing crisis. Remember, it didn't just was not just there in the US. It was again a global crisis that needed to be contained. And who can forget what happened 5 years ago? It's all globalization that keeps us connected. This is when the COVID first hit China and people didn't know about it. No one really knew what was happening. The people were traveling around the world. Goods and services were, well, of course, the goods were uh, being transported. It's more the people who were traveling all around the world. What happened? By March 2020, the world had actually was shut down. Supply chains were disrupted globally because factories were closed in China. And if the parts don't come to the US, we couldn't really do anything anyway. And that happened in the rest of the world. So we realized we didn't have enough masks. We didn't have bleach. I'm sure you all remember that, and including auto parts. So, of course, you can see globalization has, while we enjoy the benefits of supply chain, we also find that it has its own challenges. And of course, the newest and the most important challenge that we all can really be talking about would be the challenge of the emergence of AI in 2023. When the first chat GPT came, we all kind of were amazed. Google was no longer enough. It was always chat GPT. I just want to assure you, I did not use chat GPT to get any of the information, because you see the disclaimer at the end of all that, it says you must check your facts, right? So I would just want to kind of also advise you, it's great, but again, for a lot of the information, I think we need to check. But I am equally aware as all of us that the challenge AI is going to pose to us in our lives, to our jobs, is phenomenal. It's happening exponentially, and it's going to be there because it's not just in the US what's going on. We also saw the DeepSeek that came out in 2025, China's homegrown AI. And of course, we know that the information technology is all the time collecting information. So while we enjoy the benefits, we really need to be a little cautious about it as to where we are getting engaged. And I just want to, in the last few minutes, I know I'm probably ahead of, taking more time, but allow me a few more minutes to be able to share with you some important things. So I want to talk a little bit about the international partnerships and regional economic blocs. G7, what are these acronyms? G7 refers to a group of developed countries. Already mentioned the developed country, which is US, UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, France, and Italy. that consists is known as G7. So whenever there is a major political financial crisis, the leaders of the free world, they generally meet and try to see take a lead in terms of helping with financial as well as all kinds of support. And we also have what is known as G8, because Russia, is a nuclear power, and they sit on a big pile of nuclear powers. So there was a time, um, until a few years ago, I think about 10 years ago, when we also used to have a G8, which was operational, and that include G7 plus Russia. G20 was formed in 2008 because of the global financial crisis. And then we had several developing emerging economies, we like to call them, India, China, Russia, South, Argentina, and others. And with the EU and the seven countries that we have we form the G20. And you heard of the term called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They have been having this partnership, which again, because the partnership and collaborations are always good for countries, because it allows you to kind of be able to trade and set up the terms to your convenience. Again, we talked about NAFTA before, but CAFTA is the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which we have with Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and such. Mercosur exists in South America. Oh, okay, we already moved out from that. And then we have the African countries also have their free trade agreement, which is known as AFCFTA. It was signed last year. All African countries are members of that. And I think this is really going to be, because Africa is really is the most, is the fastest growing continent. We know that by working in groups, it's always beneficial. So here we come to global trade and globalization in 2025 and beyond. While we know the Ukraine, Russia, we have some geopolitical crisis been going on for the last few years. Ukraine Russia crisis. So, war has its own challenges in terms of supply of goods. Ukraine, the big exporter of wheat, which of course kind of got interrupted. So then we have Israel and Hamas crisis in Gaza and around. Um, so what is this kind of leading to? It's leading to great income inequality across the globe. We have global billionaire class, but we also have persistent world poverty. So that challenge is still there that needs to be tackled. And of course, with the tremendous growth of AI technology, while it is exciting, we are also going into a unknown territory. So we need to kind of look at it. What would be the new rules? We need to cooperate. And I haven't even talked about crypto and Bitcoin yet, the cryptocurrencies which are there. So we need to again set up new rules of the game, cooperate with other countries, and set up how we should operate in the age of AI and crypto currencies. We need to set up rules for that. We need to collaborate. And of course, we have new trade and tariff regime starting from 2025, which we are already still, our country is negotiating with several other countries. Most recent, just to give you final highlight, again, the details are um, that if we look at in the July data that came out, I have actually prepared a list of resources which provide you authentic data on trade, and some of the other resources, academic resources that you can utilize for your own teaching, as and when you need it. So it's always good to go to the source and get the data rather than just Google searching it many times. So the most recent data that came from we have from the Census Bureau, Bureau of Economic Analysis has a subpart, International Trade Administration, that provides all data. That's where I got the data for Georgia and also for Indiana. They tell us that if you look at the first half of 2025, our imports exceeded that of 2024. America's merchandise trade is really where it was even a year ago. In fact, our US deficit has widened, which means we are continuing to import at the same rate. The flow of goods and services has been continuing in spite of floods and wars that keep happening. What it tells you is that the global trade is well and alive. Finally, I just want to summarize, what did we learn today? That globalization is here to stay. As a human civilization, we have achieved great strides, conquered diseases, increased longevity, dream big by flying to Mars, and we want to live in space. And it's only through greater cooperation, globalization, and human ingenuity that we will be able to win all challenges. With that, I'd like to thank you. And for any questions, please email me anytime. Stay connected. That is skrao@iu.edu. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll be happy to take your questions.